All right, let's kick off another deep dive. Today we're looking at America's journey to becoming a superpower.
A fascinating story.
It really is. We've got a YouTube video transcript that goes through the historical milestones, and we got some
Good
articles.
exam.
Yeah, like the economic side of things and global forces at play. And it's pretty amazing when you think about
It
it.
really is.
How did a nation that started out wanting to just stay isolated, how did that become the most powerful country in history?
It is a story full of, twists and turns.
Right.
But to really get it, you have to go back to the beginning. Like when the US was expanding across North America, there was this constant debate. Should we stay focused on our own continent? Or, look beyond that?
So it wasn't like a straight shot to global dominance?
No, no, there was a lot of push and pull.
Interesting.
Yeah. So after the Civil War, you've got William Seward, the Secretary of State, pushing for expansion. He was the one who got Alaska from Russia,
Oh, yeah.
which a lot of people thought that was a bad idea at the time.
Yeah, I remember reading about that.
But it turned out to be a pretty good deal in the end. But get this, Seward also tried to buy Greenland and Iceland.
Wait, hold on. They almost bought Iceland.
Yeah.
Wow.
But Congress wasn't into it. There was a big group that really didn't want to get mixed up in things overseas. And some were even worried about, integrating what they saw as like inferior races.
Yikes. Not a great look.
Yeah, not a proud moment in U.S. history for sure. But it shows those early struggles the U.S. was dealing with, those different viewpoints.
For sure. So what was it that made America decide to become more involved globally?
Well, towards the end of the 19th century, a few things happened all at the same time. The Industrial Revolution was going strong, so there was huge economic growth. And all of that economic power led to a more centralized and strong federal government, a government that could really start to project its power, around the world.
So a stronger economy basically gave them the muscle to flex on the world stage.
Exactly.
And then you can't forget 1898. It seems like that was a big turning point. All our sources mention it.
Oh, 1898 is huge.
Huh.
That's when the Spanish-American War breaks out, and the U.S., with all its new industrial power, defeats the Spanish Empire pretty quickly. And what do they get? Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, Hawaii, Wake Island, American Samoa.
Wow. All that in just a few years.
It's pretty amazing. In just a few years, they went from mostly being on one continent to having territories all over the Pacific.
The world changed so fast back then. It makes you think how connected everything is. Like one thing happens and it can trigger a chain reaction.
Definitely.
But getting territory is one thing. Actually using power on the world stage is something else. How did the U.S. start to flex its muscles back then?
They weren't shy about it, that's for sure. They went and secured the Panama Canal Zone, sent troops to occupy the Dominican Republic, bought the U.S. Virgin Islands. They wanted to protect their interests abroad, both commercial and military. And they were getting involved in international affairs, putting pro-American regimes in places like Nicaragua and having a big say in what was going on in China. So yeah, they were definitely making their presence known.
And then, of course, World War I came along. That really put their growing global power to the test, didn't it? And what's interesting is that it wasn't just about military strength. It was about shaping the world after the war.
You're absolutely right. America stepping in really helped end the war, and President Woodrow Wilson, he was a big part of the peace talks. He had this idea for the League of Nations, an international organization that would prevent future wars through diplomacy and cooperation. A noble goal.
It was. It's a shame it didn't work out that way.
It is.
Didn't the U.S. end up staying out of the League of Nations?
Yeah, sadly they did. Despite Wilson's efforts, there were too many in Congress who wanted to stay isolated, so the U.S. didn't join. It's that constant tension you see, that back and forth between wanting to stay out of the world's problems, but also having the power and maybe even the responsibility to shape global events.
A tough balancing act.
It really is, and that question would keep coming back to haunt them for years to come. It really is a recurring theme, isn't it?
Like this tug of war between staying isolated and getting involved globally.
Exactly, and after World War II, things got even more complicated.
Yeah, because that's when the U.S. really became a superpower, right?
Right.
I mean, so much of the world was devastated by the war.
Mm-hmm.
But America came out of it,
Okay.
okay?
Yeah, they did.
And they had developed atomic weapons.
Oh, yeah, that was a total game changer.
Sure.
A whole new level of power.
Exactly.
And they definitely used it.
Right.
They saw an opportunity to kind of reshape the world, prevent another huge war like the one they had just gone through.
And that's where the United Nations comes in.
Exactly. The UN, an organization built on cooperation and the rule of law,
Right.
working together to solve problems.
Which is still a major player on the world stage today.
Absolutely.
But Our sources also talk about this thing called the Bretton Woods system.
Oh, yeah.
What was that all about?
Bretton Woods, fascinating stuff. Picture this 1944, the war's still going on, but you've got 730 delegates from 44 allied nations.
Wow.
They all meet up in this little resort town in New Hampshire. Their mission to come up with a new global financial system.
To prevent another Great Depression.
Exactly.
So while bombs are dropping in Europe, they're planning the future of the global economy in a vacation spot.
Kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is.
It just shows you how everything's connected,
Yeah.
global affairs.
For sure.
Anyway, after a lot of back and forth, they come up with the Bretton Woods Agreement.
Okay.
This agreement created the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank.
Oh, right. I've heard of those.
And these institutions, they were heavily influenced by the U.S., and their whole purpose was to stabilize currencies, promote trade, basically manage the world's finances.
Wow.
And that system lasted for decades, had a huge impact on the global economy.
So the U.S. is really calling the shots at this point, shaping the world in their image.
Yeah, they were definitely in a position of power.
But then, of course, there's the Soviet Union, the whole Cold War thing. That must have changed everything.
Oh, the Cold War. That completely dominated U.S. foreign policy for decades. They were determined to stop the Soviets from spreading their influence. That meant having a huge military presence all over the world,
Right.
making alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia, Israel, South Korea, basically anyone who could help them counter the Soviet Union.
Interesting.
And they often intervened, sometimes secretly, to support regimes or movements that were on their side.
It's kind of morally complicated.
Oh, it was. There were a lot of debates in the U.S. about whether what they were doing was ethical, the cost of all this global involvement, and whether they were actually making the world a safer place.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But the fear of the Soviets, the threat of nuclear war, that kind of overshadowed everything else.
Right, right.
It was a tense time.
Then the Berlin Wall comes down, the Soviet Union collapses, and the U.S. is the only superpower left.
Yep, the undisputed leader.
You'd think they might have said, okay, job done. Time to step back.
Some people did.
Yeah.
They wanted a more hands-off foreign policy. But most people thought America had to stay involved globally to keep things stable and, to be honest, to protect their own interests.
So they kept NATO going even though the Soviet threat was gone.
Exactly.
Oh.
And NATO didn't just continue, it actually grew.
Wow.
They brought in former Soviet bloc countries, a way to solidify U.S. leadership in Europe and project power into what had been the Soviet Union's backyard.
That makes sense.
And their alliances in Asia with countries like Japan and South Korea, they remain strong too. This Pax Americana, as they called it, this period of relative peace and stability under U.S. leadership,
Right.
that became the new norm.
But even then there were challenges, right? Different viewpoints.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Our sources talk about Donald Trump's presidency as a real shakeup.
Donald Trump, his America First approach definitely stirred things up. He openly questioned the value of alliances, said allies weren't paying their fair share.
I remember that.
And he criticized free trade agreements. He even called NATO obsolete and suggested that Japan and South Korea should maybe think about defending themselves, maybe even develop their own nuclear weapons.
That's a pretty big shift from the whole leader of the free world idea.
It is. He was definitely breaking with tradition.
Did he actually manage to change the direction of U.S. foreign policy, though?
It's hard to say for sure. He definitely caused a lot of anxiety, both in the U.S. and internationally.
Yeah.
But he faced a lot of pushback, too, from his own party, from allies, even from the military. So while he shook things up, the long-term impact of his foreign policy is still up for debate.
It's interesting that even someone like Trump couldn't completely overturn decades of established foreign policy.
That's true. There's a lot of inertia in the system.
So where does all this leave us today?
Good question.
What's the state of America's global power now with all these new challenges and, the world changing so fast?
Well, the U.S. is still a major force. Economically, they're still the biggest economy in the world with a really dynamic and innovative private sector. Militarily, they're unmatched, global reach, cutting-edge technology. And they have a network of alliances that, even if they're a bit strained sometimes, still gives them a big advantage. And then there's their soft power, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, American universities, that still has a lot of pull around the world.
So still strong, but there are some cracks showing.
Yeah. Our sources point to some internal problems that could weaken America's position in the world.
Right. Things aren't perfect. Our sources mention things like political divisions, rising inequality, even corruption. Those are problems that could really hurt America's standing in the world. Makes you think.
It
Even the
does.
biggest empires can fall apart from the inside.
It's true, and that's actually a really interesting point. Maybe the biggest threat to America isn't China or Russia, but America itself.
So their internal problems could be a bigger problem than any outside rival.
Yeah, throughout history, we've seen how things like political instability, inequality, social unrest, those things can do more damage than any enemy.
So if the U.S. wants to stay on top, they need to fix things at home.
Exactly. They need to deal with the political divide, invest in education and infrastructure, make sure everyone has economic opportunities. That's what makes a society strong and resilient.
Makes sense. But what about China and Russia? How much of a threat are they really?
Well, they both pose different challenges. China's economic power is undeniable, and they're trying to expand their influence globally, especially with things like the Belt and Road Initiative. And Russia, under Putin, has shown they're not afraid to use military force to get what they want, like we saw in Ukraine.
So a rising economic power in China and a more aggressive military power in Russia sounds like a recipe for conflict. Is it like a U.S. versus the world situation?
I wouldn't say it's that simple. The world's a lot more complicated than that. It's not a zero-sum game where if one country wins, another one automatically loses. The U.S. might still be the most powerful, but it's not the only one calling the shots anymore. You've got other players on the scene, each with their own goals and interests.
You mentioned earlier that America's biggest threat might be itself. That really stuck with me.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it?
It is. Our sources didn't really go into that, but could you maybe talk a bit more about what you meant?
Sure. One of America's biggest strengths has always been its ability to attract talent from all over the world. For centuries, people have been coming to America looking for opportunities and a better life. All those talented people, that's what's made America's economy and culture so dynamic. But what if that stops?
What if people stop wanting to come to America?
Exactly. If America becomes more isolated, more focused on its own problems, and less welcoming to the world, it could lose that edge. And in the long run, that might hurt more than anything China or Russia could do.
That's a really fascinating perspective. It makes you think about the bigger picture, how what's happening inside a country can affect its place in the world. We've covered a lot in this deep dive: the rise of the U.S., what made it a superpower, the challenges it faces both at home and abroad. It's obvious that America's role in the world is still evolving.
It is. The choices America makes now about how it deals with its problems, how it handles a world with multiple power centers, how it uses its power and influence, all of that will have a huge impact on the future, not just for America, but for everyone.
Absolutely. Learning about America's past and present helps us understand what might happen next. And this deep dive, this is just the beginning. There's so much more to explore, so many questions still unanswered.
That's the beauty of it, isn't it? America's story is still being written.
It is, and it's a story we're all a part of. Understanding it is more important now than ever. So to our listeners, keep digging, keep asking questions, keep exploring this topic, because the future of U.S. global leadership, well, is still to be decided. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.